So the S10 Plus and the XS Max certainly steal the show, but because bezels are so small these days, you can get a pretty big screen in a pretty small phone. So which one should you go for? The S10 from Samsung or the XS from Apple? It can get quite confusing. I'm just going to refer to them as Samsung and Apple from now on. So if you're looking for that smaller phone, which one should you go for? The Samsung or the Apple? There's definitely some differences between these two phones and they have a lot in common as well. So let's start off with the screens. Actually, even though these two devices are pretty much the same size, actually the Samsung is a tiny bit taller than the Apple, although it's not much wider or thicker. You do actually get quite a bigger screen on the Samsung. You get a 6.1 inch AMOLED screen on the Samsung and you only get a 5.8 inch screen on the iPhone. It doesn't sound a huge amount, but on the size of these devices, it's actually quite a lot. Now obviously both of these screens are actually manufactured by Samsung anyway. Both of these screens are absolutely incredible, pretty much the best screens you're ever going to find in any smartphone, and they should be considering the price of these two devices. The Samsung, as usual, comes in with a slightly higher PPI, a slightly higher definition screen. However, the iPhone screen, in my opinion, is enough for anyone. It's very sharp and the colors are very good. It has HDR. You know you're getting a really top screen in the iPhone, and the Samsung obviously is as well. I'd say that the colors between these two are slightly different. As usual, the Samsung just makes colors pop a bit more. They're a bit more vibrant, a little bit less real. Maybe the iPhone takes that down a little bit and makes the colors slightly more neutral. One isn't better or worse than the other, it's just personal preference, which one you prefer. What's great about both of these screens is they're AMOLED, so you get the always on display, the really super dark blacks. Probably the biggest difference between these phones is the notch or the hole punch in Samsung's case. I really like the new design of the Samsung. I really like that hole punch design. I think it just fits in with the screen at the top there really well. One of the benefits of getting the smaller Samsung is that you just have the single hole punch at the top. If you go for the bigger Samsung Galaxy S10 Plus, you get that double notch. The double notch houses an extra sensor. It's a depth sensor in there, but it's not an imaging unit. So I'm not really sure how much benefit you get from that bigger notch. Anyway, the screen is bigger in the S10 Plus, so you do get more screen real estate anyway. In the S10, you just get that single cutout there. It's very small, I think it looks very good, and Samsung have done a good job blending it in with wallpapers, so you basically can't see it anyway. And obviously we all know about the massive, huge notch that Apple are using. Now, I let Apple off using this notch because of Face ID. Face ID is a little slow, but it is incredibly secure, and I would rather a slightly bigger notch with secure Face ID than having Apple take a picture, which we know isn't secure. Obviously, an area where Samsung really does trump the iPhone is the underscreen fingerprint reader. Samsung have for the first time installed a fingerprint reader under the screen. This is an ultrasonic fingerprint sensor. Samsung say that this is very secure, certainly more secure than the other imaging sensors on the market. This actually takes a 3D map of your fingerprint, which I think is pretty cool. Other fingerprint sensors literally take a photo of your fingerprint, whereas Samsung's takes a 3D map before unlocking the phone. The iPhone doesn't have this at all. You have to rely on Face ID. I personally absolutely love in-screen fingerprint readers. There are just many occasions where you want to unlock your phone with your fingerprint and not your face. So for me, that's a big advantage for the Samsung over the iPhone, but the iPhone's Face ID, as we know, is incredibly secure. Another thing about the design I want to quickly touch on is just how small the bezels are. Now, I really like the design of the iPhone because all the bezels are perfectly symmetrical in every way except for that big notch at the top. The Samsung also has tiny bezels, but because the bezels are smaller on the side than on the top and bottom, it just looks a little bit unsymmetrical, and I think it takes away a little bit from the design. I'm in two minds because I love the smallest bezels possible, but I really love that symmetrical design of the iPhone. Again, it's personal choice, and to be honest, I can't even choose between them. Coming onto the back there and the design, these phones, both of them are just super premium. They just feel it in the hand. You get glass everywhere, aluminium or stainless steel on the iPhone. They just feel super premium. Now, they both feel really light, especially if you've come from the bigger versions. They feel light and they feel very compact. I absolutely love the colors on both of them. Now, they're both unique. They're very Samsung and very Apple in their design. I really like what Samsung have done with the camera unit at the back there. It's quite utilitarian, very symmetrical, and I like that. So that camera unit on the back of the Samsung, you get a 12 megapixel main camera, a 12 megapixel telephoto camera, and you also get a 16 megapixel ultra wide camera. On the iPhone, you also get a 12 megapixel main camera, you also get a 12 megapixel telephoto camera, but there is no ultra wide. So the big advantage I see of the Samsung here is that you get that extra camera unit at the back. Obviously the Samsung is 5 or 6 months newer than the Apple, and 2019 is the year of the triple camera at the back there, the ultra wide angle camera. This just gives a lot of different options when you're using the phone. Obviously an ultra wide camera can help you take landscape shots. If you're in the city, you can get more in. But one of the really good things about an ultra wide camera is it can act as a macro lens. So if you get very close to something, that can be super sharp in focus, and then the back can have lots of blurring or bokeh, and it just gives you options to take really good looking shots. Now you can't do that with the iPhone because it doesn't have that ultra wide camera. The new iPhones in autumn this year will have them, I'm sure. But as for now, if you're choosing between these two, that Samsung definitely steals a march on the iPhone there. Apart from the difference with that ultra wide camera, the main camera and the telephoto camera on both of these have pretty much exactly the same specs. They both have optical image stabilization, which is very important for me anyway. Focal length and aperture again are very similar. Now, as we know, iPhone and Samsung naturally take quite different images. Samsung usually saturates the images quite a lot. That is, brings colors up to very bright, very loud. Greens and reds will be very poppy. The iPhone tends to take more natural or subdued shots. There isn't a better or worse, it's just down to personal preference. Whenever I look at Samsung photos, I'm always shocked at just how poppy they are. It just seems not very real, but almost better than real life. Everything you take just pops out at you. Now on the iPhone, they're more, I guess, real to life images. What's good about the smaller versions of both of these phones is that they carry exactly the same hardware, on the back at least, as the bigger phones. The selfie cameras on the front are about the same, the only difference being that the Samsung can give you 4K recording out of that front camera. Apple sticks with 1080p. The video that you get out of both of these is very similar as well. Now that's obviously thanks to the chipset in both of these, which we'll talk about in a second. So the Samsung gives you 4K and so does the iPhone. They both shoot 4K up to 60 frames a second, which should give you a little bit of slow-mo if you play it back at the normal 30 frames a second. They both give you super slow-mo, 240 frames a second at 1080p HD quality. Somewhere where the Samsung just edges out the iPhone is that you can shoot 960 frames a second slow-mo in a short burst. This is something you are probably going to use when you first get the phone and probably forget about afterwards. But if it is important for you, it's there on the Samsung and you're stuck with 240 frames a second on the iPhone. You get fast charging and wireless charging on both of these devices, which is definitely a plus. Obviously the Samsung uses USB-C and iPhone sticking with the Lightning port. Samsung does give us the ability to put in a micro SD card in there up to 512 gigabytes, which is a really great option, especially if you're like me and you take lots of photos and videos. It means that I don't have to pay for memory that I then lose if I change the phone. I can just take it in and out. And of course, as we know, iPhone doesn't give us that option. I'm not really sure why, but the power button on the Galaxy S10 and the S10 Plus has been placed incredibly high up on the device. I really don't know why. I'm not sure if there's a manufacturing reason for this, but the power button is, for me anyway, completely out of reach with one hand. Samsung have placed this thing almost at the very top of the device on the side, and it is just completely uncomfortable to try and touch it. Now I know that we don't use the power button to turn the screen on anymore, you can just unlock it straight away. But whenever I use my phone, I always press the power button to turn the screen off as I put the phone down. This is something you can't do with one hand on the S10 Plus for sure. You can see here, it is just so high up. Now the Samsung Galaxy S10 is smaller, but they keep the high position of the power button. It's a bit easier to touch on the S10 because it is smaller, but it is still really high up there. Anyway, on the iPhone, those buttons are, in my opinion, perfectly placed, exactly where they should be. Right, let's get onto that chipset between them. Now, what's great about the smaller phones is that they also keep the full powered chipsets from the bigger devices. You get the A12 on the iPhone XS, and you get the Snapdragon 855 from the Galaxy S10, or depending on what market you're in, you might get Samsung's Exynos chip. If you have a look at Geekbench here, you can see the top performer is the Samsung. Now the S10 Plus is the top, and obviously the S10 is right up there as well. And we all know just how powerful that A12 chip is from Apple, the most powerful chip. Now because they're running different operating systems, the iPhone has 4 GB of RAM, which Apple think is enough to run iOS. And we all know by now that it is, and iOS runs pretty much without fault. The S10 gives you an 8 GB option. You can get that up to 512 gigs of storage. The Snapdragon 855 is an Android beast. I've used it in a couple of phones, and it is powerful. A really good chip, and 8 GB of RAM is gonna serve you well. So these two phones for me are so difficult to separate. Which one do you go for? If you are an Apple person and you're already in the system, you're gonna go with the iPhone. The Samsung for me is probably the best Android phone out there. That underscreen fingerprint sensor is a big bonus for me, and the extra camera on the back. Those two things alone might make you think about switching if you're an iPhone owner. Two incredible phones that give you pretty much all of the functionality of the bigger versions in a smaller body.